Welcome to my favorite class featuring shirt making with industrial techniques. It's fun, easy, and believe it or not, we won't be using any pins to make this beautiful shirt. We'll be sewing from the men's shirt pattern, but I'll highlight the way construction is different for a woman's shirt as we go along. You can use these techniques on any shirt pattern, and I'll address how to modify a commercial pattern should you choose to do so. In this lesson, I'll teach you how to sew an express order and finish a shirt in 3 hours. You'll learn to make sewing with stripes easy by using them to your advantage when lining up your pattern pieces. And we'll cover interfacing and marking our pattern pieces in preparation for assembly. Let me explain to you what the express order is that we'll be using in this class. It's something that I've developed to make sewing the project even faster. So we'll sew as many things as we can at the sewing machine before going to the ironing station, and then we'll press as many pieces as possible before we go back to the sewing station. Some of these things will be done out of the normal construction order, but believe me, it saves just a few more minutes in every project. I think you're going to really like it. And if you make several shirts at once, it'll even cut your time down more. So first of all, we want to talk about the seam allowances. And in the industrial techniques that I use and teach, we don't use the average 5/8 inch seam allowance that's on most commercial patterns. And in the industry, they don't use 5/8 very often either. So we'll need to modify any commercial pattern. So if you're making a shirt from a different pattern, here's what you need to know. You'll need to trim the neckline seam down to 1/4 of an inch. That'll be the right front, the left front, and either the back, or if the shirt has a yoke, it'll be the yoke where the neckline is. You'll cut those down to 1/4, and also the collar stand that'll be attached to the neckline. And you'll do this on the pattern piece. Now, any enclosed seam will need to be either 1/4 or 3/8 inch. And again, these are industry standards. So a cuff has enclosed seams, a collar, the sleeve placket, the sleeve to cuff seam, the yoke to back seam. Those are all enclosed seams. And if you did sew them at 5/8, the next direction in your pattern guide would be to trim them down to 1/4 anyway. So this just, again, reduces another step that you don't have to do. So to alter your home sewing pattern, do it on the tissue before you put the tissue on the fabric. And another thing that I always do if I am modifying a commercial pattern to industry seam allowances is I make a note in a dark marker or a red pen so I won't miss it that I have changed the seam allowance in this area. So when I go back to sew that pattern maybe 6 months from now, I don't have to guess whether it's a 1/4 inch or 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now I'd like to discuss the proper fabric for our project. What we want to use is shirting. And not all shirtings are created equal. Some have some synthetic fibers in them and others do not. The best, in my opinion, is an all-natural fiber, and there's several reasons for that. An all-natural fiber breathes, so it's far more comfortable to wear. It's easier to launder and maintain, and it sews so much nicer. It takes the needle better, it's just easier to work with. So don't be afraid of using a really nice cotton shirting. I would suggest cotton to begin with, but there are other fabrics that blend together that make nice shirting, like silk and linen, and those are perfectly appropriate as well. But for your first shirt, if this is your first shirt, start with a nice 100% cotton shirting. Oftentimes they're Italian shirtings, but also there are Japanese shirtings that are beautiful as well. And what is really nice about those shirtings is things that you can't see until you get up close to that fabric. But it's all about the intricate weave of the stripe. At first glance, it looks just like a stripe. But as you get closer to it, you see that there's a very fine weave structure in those stripes that make it just really beautiful to look at as well as to wear. So those are my first suggestions. But if you're making a woman's shirt, I like the fabric like what I'm wearing. And this is called Lawn, and it's made by Liberty. Liberty is a company you may have heard of years ago that was called Liberty of London. Now the name is just Liberty, but they still create this beautiful lawn cotton. It's soft, it drapes, it breathes, it's comfortable to wear, and it doesn't wrinkle very easily, so I love it for traveling. Okay, now let's talk about stripes and plaids. Most shirts, when you're making men's shirts, you see in the marketplace tremendous amount of stripes and plaids. And oftentimes I have students who shy completely away from stripes or plaids because they're afraid of all the matching they'll have to do. Well, plaids, there is more complication to matching the plaids. However, with stripes, it actually isn't a big issue. However, I do want to point out that stripes should be woven stripes as opposed to printed stripes. If you have a printed stripe, and I've got a sample right here, you can see that the wrong side of the fabric is very obvious. Number one, you don't want that because oftentimes shirts are worn open and you see the wrong side of the fabric. And if it's completely obvious that it's the wrong side of the fabric, it's kind of an eyesore. So I try to stay away from those for that reason. But moreover is the fact that when you print a stripe, they don't necessarily get it spot on the grain. So in other words, if you had a stripe that was printed off grain, you'd either have to cut your shirt off grain, which would mean it wouldn't hang correctly, or you'd have to cut your stripe off, well, you'd cut it on grain and then the stripe would be off. And that would be hard on the eye. So printed stripes, stay away from those. They're usually not as nice of a fabric again. So staying with the woven stripes is the way to go. Now, let me tell you how stripes are your friend as opposed to being something that's a big problem. So let me show you on this shirt right here that we're going to be making in the class. I chose a specific stripe to be my center front. And if I put that center front of the right on that specific stripe and the center front of the left on that same stripe, I'll have a contiguous stripe pattern across the front of the shirt, which is very pleasing to the eye. But here's where it's your friend. The center front of a shirt is where you put your buttonholes. So I already have the mark for my buttonholes all the way down the front of this shirt, and I don't have to worry that I might mismeasure somewhere and get one off by an eighth here and another one off by an eighth in the other direction. I know I'm going to stay right on target because I'm using that stripe. Now another way you can do it is use it as the straight of the grain. You know what it's like to go with the straight of the grain. You have to measure, you put your pattern down, and on all pattern pieces, of course, have the straight of the grain line. And you have to put that piece down, and generally you measure to the straight of the grain, maybe it's a selvage, and then you go over here and you measure again, and you go back and forth a few times so you get it just right. Well, here is what we do, is we just put that stripe, that grain line right on the stripe. Make sure that the tips of your collar are in the exact same location on the same stripe, because right now they're far apart, but when they go onto the shirt, they come around, they're right here, and that's what frames your face. So you want to make sure those stripes are accurate, but it's just that easy. I can just go ahead and cut this out now. And every piece you can do that with, because you can just line up that grain on the stripe and you're good to go. Now, I want to show you just a little quick tip about marking. And again, this is an industry technique for marking. In your commercial patterns, you usually have a triangle-shaped notch. And they've started to do away with those a little bit. For one reason, I think, is because a lot of people are cutting their garments out with rotary cutters. And having that little triangle-shaped notch is really problematic with a rotary cutter, as I'm sure you can imagine. So, but in the industry, they never use those because they cut everything out with a power cutter, and they have for many, many years. So what they use is a little slit in the fabric. For this class, you're going to see these marks, and I want you to just take a quick look here at these little empty spaces, and that's where you're going to make the little slit. And you make those tiny little slits, and the rule of thumb is that slit should be half the distance of the seam allowance. So if we have a 3/8 inch seam allowance, we can go slightly more than an eighth. If we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we can only go an eighth. And if we have a 5/8 inch seam allowance, we can go a full 1/4 with those slits. And you do that anywhere you see one of these on my pattern. You can change a commercial pattern if you like this kind of marking system, and I think you're going to. You can change a commercial pattern to do the same thing. You just put that slit right in the center of where that triangle is, and you'll see as we go along in making this shirt how beneficial that type of marking is. Now, one more thing I want to talk about marking is when you use these beautiful Italian striped shirtings, most often there is no obvious wrong side. You have to really get up close to see if it's the wrong side. And so it's very easy, and ask me how I know, to sew 2 right sleeves or 2 left fronts because you get them turned around. So what I do, I always test whatever I'm going to mark on the fabric. So please test on a scrap. In this case, I'm using a gel pen, but you can use a chalk, or if you don't want to mark on it, you could actually use a painter tape. But what you want to do is write wrong, make any symbol. I write the word wrong, you can put a big W, you can put an X, whatever. But do it on every piece as you pull it off the cutting table, and that'll help you keep on track when you're at the machine and you're not noticing that you're sewing it the wrong side out or something. I want to just take a little minute here to explain the difference between the men's shirt and the woman's shirt. Men's shirts always button left over right, so the buttonholes go on the left placket. Women's, it's right over left, the buttonholes go on the right side. Now, don't make a mistake on a men's shirt. If you make a mistake on a woman's shirt, you probably wear it. But in men, they're just very uncomfortable. It's too much like a lady's shirt. They don't want to wear it, so keep that straight. The other difference is usually the darts. In modern shirts now, and in the shirt pattern that we're using, there's 2 darts in the back. And that helps give a trimmer look and pull a shirt in a little bit at the waist so it's not so blousy at the waist. And of course, the woman's shirt traditionally has a front dart. In the corresponding women's shirt pattern to this man's shirt pattern, we have a dart down the front. Sometimes, though, it'll be a traditional dart on the side. But in either case, that's really the only difference at all between a men's and a woman's shirt. And if you should decide that you want to make a woman's shirt as well, you'll see in the class materials where you can purchase the same pattern that we're using in this class in the woman's version. Interfacing is an important aspect of any garment, and shirts is no exception. We're going to use 2 types of interfacing. So let me start by explaining, you probably made other shirts or their projects, and in one pattern guide it'll say put the interfacing on the facing of the collar. Then you'll go along and you get to the next pattern, and that one says put the interfacing on the collar, not the facing. And you wonder to yourself, well, which one is correct? Well, I always believe that the interfacing should always be in the piece that faces the public to give it the nice, smoothest, best finished look. However, we're going to use 2 types of interfacing in this project. We'll use a firm interfacing for the collar, and we'll use a soft interfacing for the collar facing. Why do we do that? To make them more compatible when you sew them together, when you're wearing it, and when it's being pressed. Oftentimes, if you don't put any interfacing in that facing piece of, say, a collar or a cuff, the fabric is loose and a little sloppy in there because it has nothing to give it enough body to stay firm like the collar. So now they're not compatible. And if you've ever seen this, you may have noticed if you send it to a launderer, to a shirt laundry, and they go to press that, they press the top, but the wrinkles from the facing piece underneath show on the top. So to keep that from happening and to make the pieces easier to sew together, we use a very lightweight interfacing in the corresponding pieces to the collar and the cuff. So what you want to do is test some interfacings. The firm interfacing can be several different degrees of firmness. Some people like a really stiff collar, but generally in fashion today, it's a more casual look, so it doesn't need to be quite as stiff. There'll be some sources in your class materials on the types of interfacings and where to purchase them. But do your test, and also on the softer one, I'm not as concerned about the firmness of the soft one. I just want it as soft as possible. I just want it to make that second piece compatible with the first piece. So a soft, lightweight interfacing, a sheer weight interfacing will be just fine. And then a firm facing interfacing that you know is specific to collars and cuffs. In the collar stand, and 2 of the cuffs and the left front, down the placket, you're going to put the interfacing. Now for that left front, consult your pattern guide and it'll tell you exactly the length because it's according to the size shirt you're making. We take that interfacing, we go all the way down the front, but we're shy about 1 inch at the bottom, and that's so that the hem is easy to turn when we get to the bottom. In a women's shirt, it's exactly the opposite, of course, because we know the placket is going to be on the right side instead of the left side. For the soft interfacing, the pieces that you'll need to interface is 1 of the collars, 1 collar stand, 2 cuffs, the pocket hem that's along the top of the pocket. You'll need a 1.5 inch strip, and you'll again consult the guide for the length, and that goes in the left front. And then the right front of the men's shirt is a 2.25 inch width piece, and again the length is in your pattern guide. 2 sleeve plackets. Now let me caution you about the sleeve plackets. If you're making a shirt, and you certainly could make the same shirt, let's say out of corduroy or denim, and it's really a much stiffer and firmer fabric, you may have to cut back on that interfacing. So you'll have to do those tests and make a little sandwich of 1 of the pieces of the fashion fabric you're using with a soft and 1 with a firm, and then sandwich them together and see if they're giving you the right feel. If that's not what you want, then you can back down, and in some heavy fabrics like a denim, you might only use a very lightweight interfacing. Now, if you have trouble with interfacing bubbling, and I've heard this story all over, people are afraid of using fusible interfacing. First of all, make sure you're buying a quality interfacing. Secondly, it does not shrink. Many people think after they've laundered the garment they made and they see this bubble effect. Some people call it an orange peel effect, a crepe effect, but it's all bubbly and you can't get those bubbles out. And they think, oh, my interfacing must have shrunk. That is not the case. What happened is, most likely, is that it didn't have time to completely adhere to the piece before you started moving it or manipulating it at the sewing machine. So I know what a lot of sewers do is they say, oh, it's time to put the collar on. They go over, they adhere the interfacing with the iron, they pick the collar up and they go and start to sew it. And what I think can happen at that point is the glue has been heated up and now it needs time to just sit on the surface of the fabric so the whole piece is adhered as best it can be. So here's what I do. I cut my whole shirt out the day before, and then I interface all of the pieces so that I have time to let them cool. I'm not in a hurry to sew them. So 5 minutes to cool without moving it is an excellent option. So once I've determined the exact interfacing I'm going to use for the project, then I take a piece of the scrap, it doesn't matter, you know, the shape or anything, maybe at least 6 inches square or bigger, and I put interfacing, the lightweight on one, the firm on the other, I sandwich it together, and I create what I call my stitch piece or my testing piece. And so this is what I've done here. And now I know that if I want to test my stitch length or the color of thread that I'm going to use to do my top stitching, I can do it right on this piece and know that I'll get the exact same results on my project. And when I'm ready to do my buttonholes, we all know if you're doing machine buttonholes, you want to test and make sure it's accurate on a scrap before you do it at on the actual project. And again, this piece really comes in handy for that. I've even tested sewing my button on by machine on this piece. Just keep it next to your machine, and whenever you need it, you know that the exact results you're getting from this is what you'll get on your finished project. Now let's talk about getting ready. One more step before we sew, and that's a little pressing. After you've interfaced everything, there's a few pieces you need to press. So you want to press both the right and left front along the fold lines. The right front is folded once. So as you can see, I've got that 2 1/4 interfacing in here, and this folds once. Then on the left front, we have the 2 strips of interfacing, one firm and one soft. And so this one is going to get pressed twice. So again, your stripes are your friend, because generally there's a stripe or near a stripe that fold line is going to be on. So you'll be able to press on that stripe and press on the second stripe. So once you have those pieces pressed, as well as the sleeve placket, just press it in half the full length. And I do this with any piece that's going to a long rectangle piece. If it's going to be in half after it's sewn on, I press it in half first, and it helps keep everything on track. And lastly, you want to press where you've put the interfacing in the hem of the pocket, and you press right along that edge. And once you have all that pressing done, everything marked, everything cut out, what I like to do is do all that the day ahead of time. And I set it aside, and the next morning when I come into my sewing studio, I have a kit. Everything is prepared. I've made sure I have my buttons, everything I need for this project. I know by shortly after lunch, I'm gonna have this shirt done, because I know I have all the pieces. It's just as if somebody else cut it out for me. It's just a real fresh start in the morning. So I really like to do it that way. And again, after you've made a shirt or two, you will get this down to 3 hours, just like I do. And in the next lesson, we're gonna get started sewing, and I'm gonna show you how to do it all without pins or basting. See you there.